We are thinking about evolution. My name is Josh Swamidas. I'm with Peaceful Science, and I'm here today with Fazale Rana. Fazale Rana is a creationist. He's, with reasons to believe, a biologist. And we disagree on important things, but we also agree on some things too. And we've been dialoguing now for a couple of years now. If you look in some of the links in the description here, you'll get to some articles where I explain. You can kind of see the past dialogues we've been having. And I think what's interesting and important about this dialogue is that there's been movement. We've been understanding each other more and more. We've been understanding science better, and we've been finding ways to make space for one another. Now, that's why I think this book, Thinking About Evolution, is an important book that really needs to be read. Not because I agree with everything in it. I disagree with some of it. It just came out this just like last month, I think. But this is written by RTB scholars, including Fazale Rana, AJ Roberts, the late Sue Dykes, and Mark Perez. This is a book that really reflects in a lot of ways an organizational position. And it's an important statement of where the conversation is now, raises legitimate questions, explains where they really are. And I think it's an important starting point for dialogue. And in particular, they have really thought through deeply some of the difficult questions of evolution. And that's why I really wanted to bring Fuzz here to talk about this with me for this hour, and to explore where the conversation has gone and where it's going and what's been good and where it could go from here. So Fuzz, thanks a lot for coming. Can you tell people a little bit about yourself that I might have missed?
Sure.
And maybe you can tell us also a little bit about what this book is and
sure,
why you think it's important.
Yeah, well, first of all, Josh, thanks for having me on your show. And you know, I've really come to value and appreciate our friendship over the last several years. And there were times where it was rough, but we kind of worked through those difficult issues. And I think in part that as brother in Christ, that we had an obligation, I think, to move past disagreements and seek to find a common ground, a place of unity. But then in the midst of that unity, be able to, again, have some frank conversations with one another in the spirit of really, how can we do the best for each other? So I, again, am really appreciative of the fact that you're having me on your show and we're able to talk about this. And, I'm a biochemist by training, and started off life embracing an evolutionary perspective. I came to faith in Christ after kind of a revelation, if you will, in graduate school, that the origin of life, to me at that time and to the very day, feels like an intractable problem for chemical evolution. Plus, seeing the elegant design in biochemistry, that convinced me there was a creator, and that led to my conversion. But for the first decade or so as a Christian, I held to a view that today we would call theistic evolution or evolutionary creation. And it was really later on where I, felt like I began to see not so much theological issues, but some scientific gaps in the evolutionary paradigm, similar to what I saw with the origin of life. And that really motivated me to embrace a position that we would call old earth creation or progressive creation. So that's a little bit about my journey in a nutshell. And, when it comes to the topic of evolution.
And so why is this particular book important in this?
Yeah.
It's a recent book. You've written a lot about this. Is there anything new here?
Yeah, well, I actually, to be quite honest, wasn't initially all that enthused about doing the book, simply because, there are already all kinds of books out there on evolution. Do we really need one more book? But, my colleague at the time, AJ Roberts, really championed the idea of the book. And I'm grateful that she did, because I think she felt like at RTB, we have a different approach to this whole question of evolution that is distinct from typical creationists, that's distinct, I think, from organizations like the Discovery Institute. And I've got friends at the Discovery Institute where we're not really necessarily rejecting evolution. We're not necessarily embracing all aspects of it, but rather are engaging the idea in a critical way, both scientifically as well as theologically and philosophically, really asking hard questions along the way and trying to, again, critically engage the idea. And so she convinced me that this book really was worthwhile doing. And what I like about the book is that it's not a singular voice, but really it's the voice of four scholars, if I could say that. AJ is a virologist and a molecular biologist. I'm a biochemist. Sue Dykes, the late Sue Dykes, was a paleoanthropologist. And then our friend Mark Perez is a philosopher of science, among other hats that he wears. And so we thought that would be a great combination of people to kind of come together. We always didn't agree and see things eye to eye as a scholar team, but in a broad sense, I think we all felt that overall, when we take into account all of the data, whether it's the scientific data and the biblical data, that progressive creationism seems, in our opinion, to be the most robust approach. But there's still, I think, a lot of room within our perspective to embrace, facets of the evolutionary paradigm where we're holding to our position in a very open-handed way.
So if I was to summarize that, I'd say that you guys, this is important because there is really something distinctive about how you're engaging with evolution. And I do think that that's true. If I was to fill in kind of some adjectives here or explication, tell me if you think this is a good way to put it. Despite what some people might think, you guys aren't actually anti-evolution. Isn't that right? Or is that
I would not consider myself an anti-evolution. I would say I have questions or I'm skeptical about certain facets of the paradigm, but I'm not an anti-evolutionist.
Yeah, so that's surprising. That's going to be surprising for a lot of people because a lot of creationism is defined, it seems at times at least, by anti-evolutionism. And I don't actually think that that's true of you. And I think that really comes through in this book in a couple ways that are important. I also really like that it's really built around questions. Like, here's some examples of questions. Does evolution explain all life on Earth? Is religious belief the only reason to question evolution? Now let's talk about that one for a second, right? You said that your points of skepticism are scientific, not religious. Now, some people are going to be very skeptical of that claim. Is that really true? Is it really scientific skepticism? And I'm saying that, by the way, to Q listeners and as a Christian like Fuzz, but also I really affirm evolutionary science. I'm much less skeptical of it than he is. So this isn't a baiting question to go attack evolutionary science. It's just to really give you a chance to explain why we should really take you seriously when you say that this is a scientific issue, not something else.
Yeah, well, I would say the reason for that would be, number one is I didn't grow up, in a Christian home. I was an agnostic when I came to faith in Christ, and it was really the scientific evidence that convinced me there was a creator that in some way had to be involved in bringing the very first life into existence and be responsible for the fundamental design of biochemistry. That was arrived at based on what I saw as scientific evidence. And again, I held to kind of a form of theistic evolution for, again, about a decade until I began to see, two things. One would be I thought other events in life's history seemed to me to not have robust evolutionary explanations, like the origin of eukaryotic cells, as an example. Or I think the origin of body plans is really enigmatic. The origin of consciousness, the origin of what we might call human exceptionalism, again, to me seems enigmatic. I know that there are evolutionary models to account for these transitions. I just feel as if those models are wanting. And so to me, these are reasons to scientifically to say, I don't think that, the paradigm has it all figured out. Now, to be fair, there is some aspects of the evolutionary framework that does create in me philosophical disquiet as a Christian theist. I think as a Christian theist, when I look at...
So let's pause there for a moment, just to be clear about that. I think, I do think that when I read your book, you really are raising scientific issues. Now, we might disagree on some of these things, and I think that's why this is going to be a valuable point, I think, for dialogue, even with secular scientists. And I know there are going to be secular scientists listening in on this. And, I dealt with a lot of people across the origins conversation. And I really do think reasons to believe is really worth engaging on this. one thing I really want to emphasize about them is that I've seen more than one time, even when it's been presented to them maybe in not the most polite way, where they've really responded well to criticism and to information and adjusted their position. And that's really laudable. And that's the reason why, that's a major reason why I chose to endorse the book in particular. I think that that's important. So I think that you are coming, even if people are going to disagree, some scientists are going to disagree with what you've written here. I got to say, I really do think that you're writing this in good faith, that this is really your honest understanding of where things stand right now. Now you were transitioning to deal with this question about whether or not evolution is a problem for the Christian faith. And you wrote one article about this. It's chapter 5. And by the way, there was a really good question, which I'm just going to put up on there for a moment, and then we'll try and come back to this later. What does Fuzz think evolution's major weaknesses are, and what's my response? We'll get to that question. I'd like to, I hope, by the end, but I don't want to lose our train of thought right now. So this question, you wrote a chapter that's called Is Evolution a Problem for the Christian Faith? And you answered that, yeah, actually it is. Or at least some versions of it are. And you talk about theistic evolution / EC, or evolutionary creation. And then the last chapter, chapter 25, what if big E evolution is true? And that's by A.J. Roberts. And she gives maybe the next stage of that, about maybe some different ways that Christians could make sense of evolution that maybe are different than the more standard ways that could be okay. Is that a good way to explain the situation?
Yeah. First of all, I know that there are, a number of Christians who do not see evolution as, a philosophical or a theological issue for the Christian faith. There are some people that would go as far as to say that the evolutionary framework actually is the friend to Christian theology for a number of reasons. So I recognize those points of view. And to me, I think there are certain versions of evolution that I think, I think how to say this carefully, actually raise questions about the visible beings are exceptional, that we have a special place within the creation. And there are plenty of people that advocate the evolutionary, worldview that are very quick to agree with that, right? And so part of, I think, what you see, my response and the response of other Christians to evolution is shaped by those perspectives. And it's not just simply, outspoken people like, Richard Dawkins, not necessarily to pick on him, or Henry Gee as another example that I can think of off the top of my head. But even as an undergraduate student, where I, again, was an agnostic taking biology courses, I had friends, because I grew up in a Bible Belt, in the part of the Bible Belt in West Virginia. I had friends who were Christians. And I can remember would have been the early 80s, professors taking a dig out of my friends because of their Christian worldview in biology class, and making them lampooning them. And so I grew up even as a...
So what I'm hearing is that there's kind of a context where you want to give some sort of... You don't want to say that the Christians that say there's no problem with evolution... I mean, you want to acknowledge that they're there, and you just disagree with them. And part of it is born out of some real conflicted experiences that Christians have had in engaging with people who support evolution. Is that a good way to put it? I'm trying to...
And if you understand evolution, to be an unguided, undirected process, right, where there is no end goal at all, where human beings are just the outwork of historical contingency and we're just a happenstance, then it's hard to argue with that mechanism in mind that somehow then human beings, have...
Ironically, science can't really tell us whether or not something is random and unexpected from God's point of view. It can only tell us it's random and unexpected from our point of view.
Right. Right. But again, if this is the way that the mechanism is being presented, right, and you're saying that this is how the mechanism works, then I think philosophically it does raise, or maybe theologically, it does raise the question, well, if that's the case, then how can I take the view that somehow human beings...
There are Christians, we could say, that that the way they take a hold of theistic evolution is to say that it is random from God's point of view too, and sometimes also make the claim that that's kind of what this evidence really entails, but that's not true,
right?
And I guess you're kind of objecting to that, is what I'm
right,
hearing.
right. And if you say that evolution is even random from God's point of view, that raises questions about the nature of God, right? And,
yeah, it certainly does.
Right, and so yeah. So these would essentially be my philosophical concerns. I think the issue of a historical Adam is also important, but to me,
tell us more why that's important exactly. Is it an issue of biblical authority? Is it an issue of
in part it's biblical authority, but there's also a number of key I think Christian doctrine that do rest on, again, the idea that Adam and Eve are historical individuals. And, this is not my, perception. There's a number of, biblical scholars, theologians who would, make that very
well, yeah. And it's not just a fringe movement. I mean, if you look at the history of the relationship between the church and evolution, I don't actually think the randomness thing is a durable problem in any meaningful way. But I mean, because all science talks about is from a human point of view. It really can't make claims about what God sees as random or not. But the issue of Adam and Eve has been far more substantial. That's been the place where for, over 150 years, that's been the point of conflict where, we can tolerate evolution in an ancient earth, in the animal and the plant kingdom. But when it comes to Adam and Eve, there's far more specific things said about him and far more specific doctrine around that. That's been the sticking point for people for a long time. I mean, that's been one of the big sticking points for you guys, right?
Yeah, it is. I think, from our perspective, there has to be a preservation of the idea of a historical Adam and Eve. But just back to our previous point, I've interacted with a lot of people that would embrace, again, an evolutionary perspective who were non-believers. And I just have never found them to respond in a positive way towards statements similar to like the one you're making, that, hey, from our perspective as humans, it might be random, but we can't really speak for God. Maybe from God's perspective, he's in total control of the process, and it just appears to be random to us. And I just never have found a non-believer to really respond very positively to that kind of statement. And so, to me, I find that I actually get, I think, better engagement to say, well, maybe there actually are some questions that evolution right now doesn't seem to address, or maybe the mechanisms we have as we understand currently for evolutionary transitions can't account for key events in life's history. And I find that those ideas get much more positive engagement. That's just at least, my experience.
So I want to press on this a little bit and highlight some things. So when you're talking about conversation, you're talking about conversations with people that you just called non-believers, so people who aren't actually sharing your point of view. That's who you're engaged with. You're not just engaging with other creationists. That's one of your goals. Is that true?
Yes. Yeah. That's my goal is, we're looking to engage, people who, are far away from God. And for some people, science becomes that reason why they are far away from God, or at least it's one of the significant reasons. And, I've met countless people who say that, if evolution can explain the totality of everything that we see in biology, then a creator becomes superfluous. I don't have need for that hypothesis. I'm not sure, was it Laplace or whoever, made that statement originally. But, the idea here is that, again, God just simply becomes superfluous. And so to me, if I am going to embrace some version of evolution, and I'm open, by the way, I'm open, it has to be something where when I look at the nature of the process, that it's very clear that it's compatible with Christian theism, or maybe even pushes us in that direction of Christian theism. And I think there are some ideas in evolutionary theory that move in that direction.
Yeah, so you talked about structuralism and convergence and the idea, but even then, even if it looks random and we can't see any structure to evolution, that doesn't mean that there isn't, and that God doesn't have a plan or he's not providentially guiding it. So there's a point. where I kind of wonder, like, what actually is the debate here? I don't really know, except that some people have misunderstood like the limits of science and tried to import that into theologies to say, well, that's really the way things ontologically really are.
Right. And I actually don't disagree with you, Josh. Sorry, I don't. Yeah, I agree with you, Josh. Sorry.
Yeah, double negatives. We get it.
But I agree with you. I mean, I think that it's perfectly reasonable for a Christian to say that maybe God is at work, in the evolutionary process in ways that we can't see, that what appears to us to be random is completely under God's control, and it's completely what God intends to happen. I could easily see how that makes perfect sense from a Christian.
But for some reason, a lot of theistic evolutionists haven't gone down that path, and part of it's history, right? So, but I don't fully understand why either. Do you have any ideas? I don't get it.
No, I mean, to me, when I look at what Scripture says that God has revealed Himself to us through the record of nature, to me, I think that what's going to be an entailment of that is that when we look at nature, we're really going to see very clear evidence for God's fingerprints. And so as long as you're seeing what appears to be a directionality or a teleology, to use that term, maybe, to the way things are in nature, even if it is something like an evolutionary process, to me, that then becomes a place where I can say, well, here, this does indeed look to me like it's God's fingerprints. But when your version of evolution is very difficult to distinguish from a version that would be promoted by somebody from an atheistic worldview who would argue that the logical consequences are that human life has no meaning, that to me is where I just have a hard time seeing that being consistent with, again, a theistic perspective. That's my...
Yeah, so you're really clearly stating what some of the issues are. And I would just say that I have not yet seen any coherent argument from evolution that humans have no purpose, because I just don't think science can really handle purpose very well. But you're right that there are people who have had large voices in public that have at times tried to make that point. So that does really complexify it. And I think we really need to separate that, but it's hard at times. All right. So what's interesting, and I think and I also really want to thank you for making this available to us. Like, you guys are allowing us to make available the last chapter online. So if you're a patron, you can get advance access to this right now, actually, if you click at the links. And to see like the last chapter, which is what if Big E evolution is true? First of all, I think that's a really notable and, dare I say, humble question to ask. It seems like you're really putting there right on the table that maybe you're wrong. Maybe that Big E evolution is true. So what is Big E evolution is, and why would you ask that hard question as co-authors of what if it's true?
Yeah, and just to be clear, all of the authors accept that there's very clear evidence that some features in the biological realm clearly are explained through evolutionary processes, and there's a robust body of evidence that supports that. And again, our primary concern that we express in the book would be with what we would consider to be some of the key and major transitions in life's history, and then also questions about, can evolution truly generate a novelty? So these are, again, the what we mean by Big E evolution versus, evolution in a general sense.
Well, it's interesting you leave out what I think has historically been the biggest issue, which is whether or not humans share common ancestors with the great apes, right? The common descent of man. You wouldn't consider that part of Big E evolution?
Yeah, I would. And this is a place where I would actually say that somebody is completely within their rights to look at, the biological similarities between humans and other creatures, including the great apes, and conclude that we share an evolutionary ancestry. So to me, that's a completely reasonable position.
When you say rights, I mean, of course, it's within our rights by the government. You mean within the bounds of Orthodox Christianity is what you mean, or
I think within
good science.
I think somebody. In other words, I'm not somebody who says there's no evidence that humans share an evolutionary ancestry with other creatures. I think there's really compelling reasons why people would draw that conclusion regardless of their worldview. That's what I meant by that. So,
you see that there is like legitimate reasons why people, whether they be atheist or Christian, would conclude that we share.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
That's
and
not
now,
crazy to you, right? Can you just like give some examples of what you mean by that? Not
well, I mean, to me, I think
what you're talking about.
I mean, to me, the evidence that would be I think the singularly most compelling evidence would be shared non-functional, sequences within the human genome and the genome of the great apes, where you can actually construct these nested hierarchies with those sequences. I think that's compelling reason to think that there's common descent. But one of the points we make in the book is this idea that in science you face what's called the indeterminacy problem, or sorry, not the underdeterminacy problem. That is, theories are always underdetermined by data. In other words, what that means is that a set of data can never exclusively support a single theory and rule out other theories, that there are other theories that could in principle exist that may be radically different than the theory at hand and could still accommodate or account for that data, or that data would be full in support of that theory. And so one of the things that we argue at Reasons to Believe is that you could actually look at those shared biological features as reflecting shared design as opposed to shared descent. And we point out that there, in the history of biology, there was that idea that did indeed exist prior to Darwin. So that would be, where we would say, yes, there is evidence here for common descent. There's no question about it. And I do feel the thrust of that evidence. But what we're doing with our approach is to say, here's a possible alternative explanation for those shared features that we think can fully accommodate the data. Now, to be fair, we've not really done the hard work of producing what we would call an RTB genomics model to account for those shared, genetic features. That's a project that's kind of in the wings that we're looking to do. So, to be fair, we've not pushed on that question, as hard as we should, but that's how I would engage that idea of shared,
So I think I want to engage that and really come back to this earlier question we had, because I think it's really interesting, actually. So what I would say is that there's a couple features about your answer that are really worth noting. One is, and I'm going to focus on the parts I agree with, and then hit on maybe explain one place where I want some explanation, because I think I might disagree with you. I think what you're saying here is that this question about what evolution's major weaknesses are isn't actually necessarily where the focus should be. Because I agree with you. What you're saying is that with the same evidence, there might be multiple processes that could have produced the same evidence. That's entirely true, right? And just because you have a model that fits the evidence doesn't mean that the other ones don't. And in fact, you could say it the other way around. Just because evolution doesn't fit the evidence, if that's what you were convinced, doesn't mean that a particular model of creation does either. That it's not like this zero-sum game that we really have to consider a model alongside the evidence and see if it's actually consistent or not, right?
Yeah.
And I've said this, I've gone on the record before. I mean, I don't actually hold to your model. I mean, I affirm evolution more broadly publicly than I think you do. But I do think that your model is close to something that could be entirely consistent with the evidence. Now, the part where I think there might be some disagreement, and I want to ask you about this, is the question about whether or not there's any contradictory evidence is one question. The other one is how much is actually explained by the model. And by explained, I think by explained, we mean that in a particular way, at least I do. What I want to know is there a mathematical theory that gives finer grained detailed predictions that are consistent with the evidence that in that sense? And so you mentioned, for example, the notion of non-functional DNA in their genomes, but there's a lot of details there that seem to be really well explained by common descent that I don't think there's a comparable mathematical model in sight yet. Now, maybe we'll come up with one, but that explains that right now. So yeah, of course, God could have made us in a way that looks like we share common descent. But how do you deal with that? I mean, would you agree with me that you don't have a way to mathematically explain a lot of the nuanced details in the data yet? Maybe you could in the future, but you don't have that yet.
Yes, I would fully agree with it, and that's part of the reason why I said that we haven't really done that hard work of pressing the model to that degree of detail. That's something that's needed, and there's been a project that I've had in the back of my mind that I really feel like I need to tackle.
Why haven't you done it? Why not?
Well, because there's just other things that are going on that I'm also interested in as well. It's
you hear that, Reasons to Believe supporters. If you're here, you should talk to them about actually doing a project on this. I'll work with them to help them too, but they're probably going to need.
Well, and that may be something
that you guys care about it. Maybe you want to help fund it.
Actually, in all seriousness, that might be something for us to maybe have a conversation about. Is really developing an RTB genomics model, or can we even develop a genomics model that can account for?
Yeah, it's a question, because I think, in fairness, Fuzz, if we're going to really do science, we might find out that there's not a way to make it work without making adjustments, right?
Right, and if that's the case, that's the case. And then if that's the case, then I think I would be in a position where I would have to say, no, common descent really is the way to go, and then look at saying, how do we then, approach, other aspects of our model in light of that. So I'm open to that. It's just that I don't think we've done enough work yet, and it is an important project. I agree with you. There's other important projects that I'm trying to work on as well.
Well, that's why I'm appealing to your base here, Fuzz. Like, let's get them engaged. Anyways, let me take this forward in another way too. Honestly, I'm looking forward to that conversation. We should have it. I'm curious to see what happens. So maybe we don't actually disagree on this one. I would just say that, it's not all fully explained yet, but I want to explore that and see if there's a way to make that model work. But let's look ahead. And I think, like I said, I think it's a very humble question to ask about what if big E evolution is true. That was I would even go to say a courageous chapter to include, given some of your audience. While you guys are not anti-evolution, if we're honest, some of your audience might be, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And they're drawn to you because they might be more opposed to evolution than maybe even you are, and that's okay. It really is okay. Some people are allowed to be that way. Maybe I'm wrong, and evolution really is something that I need to give up on. So I think that takes a lot of courage. And what's interesting, I think, about AJ's chapter, and why I think it's really important, is it seems like really for the first time that I know of in public, you really said that there might be some models and understandings of how to understand evolution and scripture and Adam and Eve in particular in a way that might be biblically faithful to you. In a sense that maybe it's not your view. So to be clear, you're still a creationist. You're not coming out as a theistic evolutionist. But you are saying, and you've had a lot of objections to theistic evolution in the past, but you're saying, but maybe this version here, maybe isn't the problem. I mean, we don't actually object to that. Is that a good way to explain it?
Yeah, that is. I think, Josh, your idea of the genealogical Adam is really, really intriguing. I don't disagree even in the least bit with the scientific approach that you've taken with that. I've got some theological questions, but I think what you've produced is a model that could retain a historical Adam and Eve, and even retain a historical Adam and Eve that were de novo creations in the context of human evolution. And so that to me is, really, if I may say so, I think a landmark contribution to the conversation is that, wow, here's a different approach that could be taken, to the question of human origins that, is compatible with an evolutionary paradigm, and so to me, I think these are the types of breakthroughs that we need to have, because that now creates, this dynamic environment where instead of trying to protect our territory, what we need to be doing is, looking to how can we maybe produce a collection of models that have strengths and weaknesses, and then really work to see what is the best approach. Is there maybe even a way that some of these models might even be combined to create kind of more of a synthetic model. I mean, I don't agree with some of Bill Craig's ideas on human origins, but I think it's great that Bill Craig is coming to the table with a distinct perspective from mine and from yours. This is really healthy, I think. And to me, I really hope that we can move beyond the young Earth, old Earth debate that was so vitriolic and instead say, hey, let's welcome people to the table and let's have vigorous conversations about this and look for ways forward. And so part of the motivation behind that chapter, which AJ wrote it, but I fully agree with what she wrote, is, hey, Josh has an interesting idea that merits conversation. This might be a way, to retain a historical Adam and Eve in light of evolution. I think even if evolution is true, it's still, again, there are ways in which I think God is still necessary. I mean, yeah, maybe evolution is true, but who was responsible for the process of evolution? Could you see that the need?
Even then, we don't know if God was necessary or not, and how evolution proceeded on life on Earth. I mean, so much is like left to contingency. That right. Contingency is just a shorthand in biology for saying we don't really know how this happened.
Right.
The way it did.
Right.
Right. But I agree. But with this, I mean, I want you to explain a little more, because I think there's going to be a lot of people really confused. I think some people have really thought that you guys are anti-evolutionists, that you've already been presented lots of models that make sense of the evidence, and you've just been a holdout, and it's not really clearly why, except for like some presuppositional opposition to evolution as a whole. Can you kind of explain specifically what some of the things are about some of the new ways that are being discussed that are making space for things that you really cared about? What were those things you really cared about that really were being missed?
Yeah, well, to me, I think, the things that I really care about would be, of course, a historical Adam and Eve. I think,
so like, for example, Biologos, they have, some people, I mean, it's maybe not, the majority or like their main message, but there are some people that affirm historical Adam and Eve there. But it seems like there's some sort of disconnect. I don't understand it fully, to be honest. Maybe you can clarify.
Well, I mean, we've spent a long time over the years engaging Biologos, and our engagements have kind of waned in recent years for no real reason in particular.
Or reasons like COVID, for even.
Yeah, but the thing is that there are people in the Biologos camp who espouse a version of theistic evolution that, at reasons to believe, we're like, wow, we're really not that far apart. And there's other people who espouse a version of theistic evolution that we feel very uncomfortable with, right? And so Biologos,
it's kind of like a broad enough range.
Yeah, they're trying to create an umbrella organization that allows space for a variety of perspectives to be engaged. And so, in a sense, there's not a singular view at Biologos, which is one reason why I think our interactions with you, Josh, in your organization, Peaceful Science, have been productive, because we actually, both of us, have positions that are fairly well defined, right? Where we can now have a place where we can say, okay, how do we move forward? When we've engaged Biologos, it's been at times frustrating, as much as I like, and consider many of the people there at Biologos friends. It's been frustrating because they might have their own personal views, but they never are willing to say, these are my personal views, at the expense of trying to preserve the overarching objective of the organization, which is to be kind of agnostic.
Well, the irony, though, is that they certainly had a lot of problems with my position, and they had no problem expressing that. I think part of it, what's going on is, and it's not just Biologos, I think that, just to speak more broadly for a moment, I think that we really have a hard time working through how to have community across differences. And my point of view is that real community doesn't arise when we hide our differences and just merely focus on common ground. Of course, it doesn't arise when we only focus on our differences and never deal with our common ground. But it's really real community arises when we're able to talk about differences and even say, hey, I can accept you're a Christian, but I really disagree with that point of view. And it's not something that should be hidden. And that actually isn't something supposed to break community. It's something that actually enables it, because then we can kind of hash those things out.
Right.
And and that gives like the freedom to actually be more clear about where we specifically stand on things, be more clear about where we disagree, but also do it in a context where there's connection, right? And I think that that's, for a lot of reasons, that's really hard right now in our society. Wouldn't you agree?
It is, and it's a tragedy. It's an absolute tragedy that, you know, we live in a country where we cannot disagree with one another, you know, and preserve, you know, a sense of community. The way people are defining community now is that group that perfectly agrees with me. I mean, I can't tell you how many, you know, I've written and done some videos on the COVID, you know, the new COVID-19 vaccines, the messenger RNA vaccines, which just is incredible science. And there have been literally people saying, I like everything that you've written that I've ever read, except for this. I can no longer even read another thing that you've ever written. You're just persona non grata to me, right? So I'm no longer invited into that person's, you know, sphere of community because I have the temerity to express a different opinion than this person, right? And so this is, I think, a real tragedy. You know?
Yeah, so in that way, I really just think that Biologos is just reflecting that larger societal problem. So we shouldn't be too hard on them,
right?
But I mean, the irony is that we have a big tent in peaceful science too. I mean, we're not even a Christian organization. There's atheists that come along with us, right? We had Nathan Lentz come to the workshop that you really graciously held to talk with us about human origins. What was it like having Nathan, who's an atheist? He's gay, married with adopted kid. Nice guy, but pretty different, right?
Yeah, well, but you know, I really enjoyed getting to meet Nathan, and you know, I would reasons to believe we're absolutely committed to have conversations with people who don't agree with us, you know, and we are, as a major portion of our strategic plan, are deliberately trying to put in place programs, you know, that create or facilitate those kind of ongoing interactions. You know, I'm not afraid of Nathan, and I'm not afraid of his questions. In fact, I view his questions of our model and his criticisms of our model as actually a gift, because it means that, okay, these are things that I've got to engage. And to me, I think it's wrong if we dismiss criticism. It's important that we engage that criticism, you know, and so, in other words, I just see a lot of apologists, you know, and people that are in the science faith conversation really sidestep criticism by somehow trying to convey that criticism is illegitimate, versus saying, okay, this is a legitimate question. This is a legitimate concern. I need to honestly engage it. Can I come up with a way to respond to this in the context of the model that we are presenting, as opposed to, again, ignoring it or dismissing it?
Yeah, and I'll say that you've had very strong interactions with both the origin of life community and physicists. It's been a little bit harder with biologists, but I think that what I observed between you and Nathan was really something great to see. It was a really positive interaction, and I really hope there's more of that with biologists going forward. But I think we kind of missed the key question, the key issue. So if I could maybe summarize some of the key things that are new is that it's actually affirming historical Adam and Eve, maybe even de novo created. I think also it matters that it's making sense among secular scientists too.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Also, that there's some clarity on the specifics that you can actually engage. So it's a little less like pinning Jello to a wall, as a way to paraphrase what I'm hearing. Anything else? Like, because I think it would be helpful for people to know, like, how to actually do things that are going to be helpful to you. I think this has been part of the gap. People don't really know what the hang-up has been.
Yeah, well, and to me, again, I think, you know, it's not only a historical Adam and Eve. I think we are also concerned about essentially robbing humanity of its special place within creation. You know, that to me is a really critical issue. I think also, you know, do we see, again, an indication of God's fingerprints, or do we see features that could be interpreted really as God's fingerprints within creation? And, you know, our approach at Reasons to Believe is really, not simply just to critique evolution, but rather to try to come to the table with an alternative explanation, or with our particular model for how we see the world, right? And how we see science supporting, our model for the world. So we talk about a creation model where a lot of what we do is trying to build actually a positive case for our position, more so than saying that we're going to essentially focus our efforts on, attacking the evolutionary paradigm. It doesn't mean that we don't engage, contrary perspectives, or that we aren't asking hard questions of alternative views. It's just that we don't want to lead with our sole focus being critiquing an idea.
Because even if the evolution is false, doesn't mean that your model is true.
Exactly. Or it doesn't mean that just because the current conception of the evolutionary framework isn't true, doesn't mean that it's not true either.
Wow.
And this is something I think that's really important, that I've tried to do, and it's not all that easy to do, to be fair. And that is to make sure that the ideas that I'm engaging in evolutionary theory actually reflect the ideas of evolutionary theory that are at the forefront, that are the best ideas, that are the leading ideas. There's a lot of Christian apologetics that are engaging ideas in evolutionary theory that are 30, 40, 50 years old, and that nobody holds today, right? And so to me, I think it's really important to make sure that we're fairly representing, what evolutionary...
Yeah, and you actually reached out to us on this book, and you asked us to review the book. I didn't end up doing the peer review of it, but there was a biologist that I found who affirms evolution. He's not a progressive creationist that reviewed it. He doesn't actually agree with everything you said, but he would say, and I talked to him afterwards, he thought that you guys made a good faith effort to represent your best understanding of where things stand. And you made edits in response to his peer review. I think that was really big of you to actually have someone that you disagreed with review the book in a legitimate peer review.
Thank you. Yeah, well, that's our intent, and do we always succeed? No, but I'm perfectly fine, again, hearing that kind of criticism where it's like, I don't think you've fairly represented this view. Then I definitely will take that to heart, and will try in future efforts to make sure that I, am doing what, reflects, I think, honest scholarship.
And so we have about 10 or 15 minutes more now. I want to talk a little bit about history for a moment and where the conversation's been. Because you've been in the conversation a lot longer than me. I mean, I was kind of watching from the sidelines some of this stuff. I mean, a lot of people were. And there's this conversation about Adam and Eve that's been going on for, let's say, about 10 years or so. Really, in a lot of ways, starting with an article published by BioLogos in 2010 by Daryl Falk and Dennis Venema. You remember that article, right? I do. And you weren't on board with it at the time. You ended up publishing some objections to it. Some of the objections, in retrospect, I would say were sensible. Some of them maybe not so much. That's how the Mouflon sheep got associated with you. And so that was really an important part of the conversation, wasn't it?
I think so. Why
is this the place where you decided to kind of publish your objections to it and really push back? What a lot of people were saying was the mainstream consensus.
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, I felt with respect to our position that, this idea that there was a population of humans as opposed to a primordial pair is an idea that I personally find challenging to square with the biblical text. And I do appreciate people that adopt the kind of a representative view for Adam and Eve. I think that's a movement towards in the right direction towards embracing a historical Adam and Eve in light of that evidence. But the claim was that the evidence from population genetics indicates that there's no way there could be less than 10,000 individuals that ever existed at any point in time in human history. And so we attempted to really engage, the scientific evidence, that was being presented towards that end. And part of that was, attempts to look at work in conservation biology and ask the question, does this work actually support the modeling that is done, in terms of determining the human population sizes, but so, that's where the Mouflon sheep,
Well, there's weird equivocations going on throughout this because, and I jumped on you a little bit hard at the Human Origins workshop a little bit. I mean, it turns out that, population genetics is a very well thought out, mature field, but a lot of the ways it was reaching, the conversation in the church, there was a lot to be desired. And I would say, whether intentional or not, I can't say. I can't speak to intentions or motives, but there were some large equivocations. Like, one of them was this idea that effective population size was telling you, what the actual population size is. And that's not true. I mean, it has this word population size and it doesn't. So then that's just not conceptually what it is. So if you look at Mouflon sheep, then you'll see that the effective population size never goes down to a single couple, even though maybe they did start with a single couple. But that's not necessarily a problem. The problem was thinking that effective population size could tell you that in the first place, which is what they were doing. So the whole conversation ended up getting pretty confused, right? Well, at least I think so. Do you see that too, or am I overstating it a bit?
Well, to be fair, my training is in biochemistry, and that's actually where I've done a bulk of my work, and so, when you do a science faith, you get involved in the science faith conversation, many times you are forced into areas that you don't necessarily have the level of expertise that you would necessarily need to really, fully engage, certain topics. And so you do the best you can to read and try to understand, and then to think, to thoughtfully engage ideas. Everything that I write, I try to find support for in the scientific literature. So I'm trying not to just fire off, at the
when I look at that history, the part that I found most, frankly, appalling about it is that a lot of the stuff being said was just not true. But for some reason, there wasn't. I mean, I don't really know of anyone who kind of stepped up from the mainstream science point of view and said, that's kind of overstating it. And helped you work through that. That just seems strange to me. Like, why? I mean, we don't have to agree on everything for me to say, hey, good science is really important. And, maybe we disagree on some stuff, but what they're saying isn't really accurate. Why didn't that happen? Like, why were you alone in this?
Well, I don't know the answer to that question.
Are you as bothered about it as I am? I mean, maybe I'm more bothered because it's my community. I really think that they should have done a better job.
Well, I think, the part of the problem when we engage in the science faith conversation, and I really hope this isn't the case for you, but oftentimes we end up having to carry around one another's baggage. So there are a lot of things that our view in terms of even the design argument differs substantially from the Discovery Institute, but yet people view me as espousing the same line of reasoning, the same types of arguments as the Discovery Institute, right? And so the point being is that many times we wind up carrying baggage, and I think a lot of people that are non-believers look at these kind of discussions and just feel like it's a waste of their time to even engage them, right? They just see that as infighting among Christians, and they don't even really have an interest in engaging the question or even weighing in on the question. And probably, frankly, part of that reason is they've not had good experiences in the past when they've attempted to do those things.
It's probably true, but I guess that's part of the reason why. I mean, that's part of the reason why we end up having to really form peaceful science. Is we want to do it differently. I mean, we don't have to agree with you. It's just think that good science is important, and to really. I mean, we can think someone is ultimately wrong, but we still don't have evidence against that, and we should be honest about that. So one thing that actually has happened, which is important, is that Biologos last year, they knew about it for a couple of years, and it was hard for them to work through it. I think it's still hard for them to work through it. They quietly acknowledged that they had overstated some of the evidence, and then without really noting it anywhere, they just deleted that article from 2010. That's, I think, very significant on a couple levels. First of all, it shows that even though I mean, in my opinion, I think some of the pushback you gave wasn't quite right, and that's okay. Ultimately, I think it really vindicates you in that maybe it was good to push back because there was some issues there in that particular case. To the point that Biologos, in its way, maybe not as clear or transparent as we'd like, has actually acknowledging that. And I think that that's important. That's part of how the conversation moves forward. And it's hard to acknowledge when mistakes are made. And I'm really glad that Biologos has done so in some small ways. You know, I asked them to put back that article online with an explanation of what it got wrong. And, you know, it's been about a year. They haven't done that. I think it's a little bit of an issue. What do you think about that particular issue? I mean, are those the sorts of things where we want to be better as Christians in science about actually being clear about how our positions have changed, being transparent about where we stand and how our views adjusting on the science?
Yeah, I think that is important to do. I think, to be fair, sometimes it's hard to do even from a logistic standpoint. That's one of our challenges. But in the spirit of that, when we first published Who Was Adam, which is our attempt to reconcile old Earth creationism with the data in anthropology, the book was published in 2005. In 2015, we did a 10-year update where we left the original book intact on purpose, so that there was no way that anybody could accuse us of doctoring things to make our position look good. And then we had a third section to the book where we just said, hey, this is what's happened in 10 years that we think is significant in anthropology. This is where we feel like our case still persists. This is where we clearly got things wrong. These are places where our predictions were failed, and then revised the model accordingly. We had a section where we said, hey, these are criticisms that have been leveled against our model. So we're not going to hide the fact that there's been criticisms, and this is our response to those criticisms, for better or for worse. So we've tried to model that approach, at RTB.
Yeah, we were talking about this too. You're talking about the logistic issue, and one thing I appreciate from talking to you is that I think the intention is certainly there to be transparent and clear about it. But sometimes, like, the processes can be matching there. We talked about the idea of maybe even like having a way, because you also do have a lot of articles and your position has changed. What if there was like a way that people could actually just help you out by like actually submitting issues of like, hey, maybe this article needs to be updated, or at least have a note on it that maybe it's not your best understanding at this point. That's like a good idea. Would that help?
Yeah. I mean, definitely, we would be very open to that. Because I struggle with the idea, that you're pointing out, is that, for example, when it comes to Neanderthal interbreeding, we've changed our view substantially, and it's been in response to the evidence. I mean, early on, there didn't look like there was evidence for human Neanderthal interbreeding, and I think the case for human Neanderthal interbreeding is extremely compelling now. And so we do have articles.
And to be clear for people listening in, that's not a costless statement that Fuzz made. I mean, there are people in your camp that are really uncomfortable with you saying that.
Oh, they're still uncomfortable. They still are wanting us to come up with some way around this. And it's like, this is what the data says. And so we need to adjust our model accordingly. And my preference would be that there wasn't interbreeding, but there is, or there was, I guess. And so we've got to engage that idea as faithfully as we can. But there are older articles on our website that reflect earlier thinking, but as you look through time, you can see where there are very clear points where.
So on a technical level, I mean, this is where I appreciate dealing with you. I mean, it feels really upfront. Like, I mean, you're moving through like a website transition right now. Frankly, we're in the middle of that too, to address exactly these issues. We want to be more transparent about how changes are made on our website. And so we're moving to a different, back end system that will make that possible. And I'm happy to share that with you if it's helpful too. But
yeah, that would be great.
And actually, if you put me in time, I mean, let's talk about that offline. There are technical issues, but we're going to have it actually eventually at some point, at a point where really the full audit history of every article is publicly available, and there'll be no confusion about that. And more than that, too, we just want to be really clear about the places where we've made mistakes and we were wrong, and we've changed our position. That's something we care about. I think it's really critical, partly because it really humanizes the people that we've told the wrong things to. It really trusts them to see us as people that make mistakes, that and forgive us for it and move forward and engage with it. And it really prevents us from doing damage to public understanding, which I think can really persist for a very long time on issues when we're not honest and clear and transparent about correcting our mistakes, right?
Yeah, I think so. And it's not an easy thing to do. And I think it's also reasonable to say, look, I think I may have gotten this wrong, but I'm going to keep pressing a little bit longer just to see if there's a way I can salvage this idea. But I think, when the evidence is against your original understanding, I think it's important to acknowledge that and to adjust. Because my hope is that when people come to RTB and come to the work that I've done, that they know that what I'm presenting is, to the best of my ability, an honest and open assessment of the data, that I go out of my way to try again to make sure that I'm fairly representing alternative perspectives, right? That or the perspectives that I'm engaging the best ideas. And it doesn't mean that I always achieve that, but that really is the intent. And I want people to trust that what I do, reflects that effort.
Yeah, and I think that's ultimately why. I mean, I think that is a scientific impulse. I think that's what it means to do good science. I mean, that's why we have crazy terms like publication ethics in science, because how we handle the public record actually is extremely important to us as scientists. So I think it's really in that vein that I think it really does make sense for us to really, really expect that when really big claims that have had a big impact on the conversation are raised or dealt with, that we do more than just a stealth deletion, right? That we actually sit down and help set the record straight. So I really hope the BioLogos will make that change. What do you think? You have some friends there. Do you think they will, or what do you think will happen?
Well, all I can say is that the people that I know who have engaged over the years, to me feel as if they're, people of high integrity. So, I would like to think that would be,
Yeah, I'd like to think that too. Let's see what happens. I mean, I'll keep you updated how it goes. So, a final question, and we probably should get going from here, is, there's a lot of change that's happened really in the last couple of years, right? In the conversation and the range. And you guys have your position, which I want to be very clear is not evolution. It's progressive creation. It's old Earth. Has Adam and Eve about, 200,000 years ago at the headwaters of Homo sapiens, or something close to Homo sapiens. But you also have a large scholar network where people are engaged that has more diversity. And it was really interesting engaging with them through the workshop. Some of them were there in person. Some of them were engaging in different places. What would happen if you found out that one of them was actually okay with evolution now and took something similar to the genealogical Adam and Eve? Would that be a problem? Are they no longer one of you? Or is that not really what progressive creationism about? Maybe that could be a version of progressive creationism in your camp. That's just not the main one. I mean, where are you guys falling on that?
Well, within our scholar community, we do have distinctives that characterize reasons to believe, and we want to make sure people in the scholar community fully understand what our distinctives are as they seek to align with us. But we actually don't expect people to walk in lockstep agreement with us. That there is a space for a range of views within our scholar community.
Yeah, but I'm wondering, is actually affirming the common descent of humans with the great apes alongside a genealogical Adam and Eve, is that within the range of views that's tolerable?
And
I mean, it's certainly tolerable within the church, but is it tolerable within your scholar community is my question.
Most likely. I mean, we are still actually having ongoing conversations as to really what are the limits, what are the boundaries. And, the broad feeling is that we would much rather have people that again represent a range of perspectives, because we just feel like that's the healthiest way to proceed.
This is like the beautiful thing about it, though, is like, actually, I do think that there are a couple of people on your scholar. I'm not going to out them now. I think that they actually do hold that view now, or are very open to it.
Yeah, and that would not. I think that wouldn't be a problem. I mean, it would just simply, okay, you're still welcome here. We want to hear your perspective. This creates an environment where we can engage, thoroughly different issues as we look to progress forward.
So this is where I think there's something exciting happening, though, because there's an opportunity, I think, for Reasons to Believe to be a real big tent in a way that that could really have a lot more diversity than really any other place, and I think that would be pretty cool. I mean, I think the only place that might compete with you on that might be Peaceful Science, right? But
well, but I mean, the thing is, we want people who are in the scholar community to really feel comfortable with who we are. Right. And if you don't feel comfortable, then, obviously they might choose to select out of the community on their own accord. But again, I know that there are people in our scholar community who have very different views of Genesis 1 than we have, who have very different views, again, about a lot of different issues that we hold to. And so we're still internally trying to figure out really where are the boundaries, that we're going to, as an organization, feel comfortable with. But our orientation is towards accepting and including people as opposed to excluding people.
Yeah. So this creates an interesting situation, though, where, you have some major, objections to many of the versions of theistic evolution that are out there in evolutionary creation. But there's an opportunity for some versions of theistic evolution, or whatever. I don't really like that term personally. I call myself a Christian that affirms evolutionary science. But there's an opportunity for some versions of case that might blur with progressive creation in some important ways. That's a little weird, right?
It is weird, but to me, I think that's actually exciting, though. Right? Is for example, I'm becoming somewhat interested in the idea of structuralism, and I see that as a version of evolutionary theory that I think begins to bump into.
And I'm going to put you in contact with one of our scholars, Zach Ardern, who's a postdoc who's focused specifically on structuralism. I think you're going to really enjoy talking to him. I'm familiar with his name. I'm familiar with some of his work, and so I'm really intrigued with what he has to say. I'm impressed with the work of Simon Conway Morris. Yeah.
In that area, and I mentioned to you off air, I've just finished a manuscript for a book called Fit for a Purpose, which is exploring the idea of a biochemical anthropic principle and biochemical fine tuning, and what emerges out of that is that you are actually, if indeed a type of anthropic principle exists in biochemistry, you are forced to a biochemical version of structuralism, where maybe the origin of life isn't through your grandfather's chemical evolution, but rather through some kind of structuralist version of chemical evolution, where the endpoints are in the origin of life are prescribed by the very laws of nature.
This way of it is just, that'll be very fun. I actually would love to have that with you and Jim Torr at some point, but but I think this is really exciting, though. I mean, I think it's a really good and healthy thing. Could it be uncomfortable for some of your audience?
Probably, because I think people definitely want certainty, and if anything I've learned as a Christian is that our faith is not characterized by certainty, right? That when we are living a life where we are interacting with and trying to follow, the God of the Bible, God is anything but uncertain. God is anything but predictable, but he's definitely good, and he's trustworthy. And so to me, I think there's a lot of people that crave certainty, and yet I don't think that's the nature of science. I don't think that's the nature of faith. And so when it comes to the science-faith dialogue, to me, certainty isn't something that really should ever exist. I mean, I like to say that, that the more I do Christian apologetics, the less convinced I am of any one argument for God's existence or for the reliability of the Christian faith. But the more convinced I am that Christianity is true, if that even makes any sense. I'd
say the more I look at the science, I see the nuance and all that. But when I look at Jesus, honestly, it really does seem like he rose from the dead.
oh yeah, of course. I mean, that's certain. Point well made.
But yeah, look, I'd say that the payoff, I mean, yeah, you're right. We do have to trade certainty on peripheral issues to engage in the grand conversations. But the payoff is the grand conversation.
Yeah.
There's an opportunity for fun where it's not threatening. There's something playful here. There's something fun. I got to tell you, Fuzz, and I'm pretty sure that the feeling is mutual, though you can tell me if I'm wrong. We've come to real friendship and affection towards one another through this, even though we disagree on things, to the point where, their disagreements are real, but they're actually places for constructiveness and make it more interesting. I'm glad we don't agree on everything, because it kind of gets a little bit boring at that point. And, there's something beautiful here. I was talking to Mike Heiser about this last week. He asked how the conversation had been going, and I talked about places where it's been hard, but then reasons to believe came up, and I said, it's been virtue in the wasteland. It's been beautiful. This is like a taste of the kingdom of God, hasn't it been?
It has. No, I'm so grateful that we are friends, and and again, I'm grateful for the way that you've approached our organization with kind of an open hand, and you've been generous towards us as well, even though you don't agree with us, and I think you have the best at heart for what we're trying to do, and I hope that you feel like we have the best at heart for what you're trying to do, and that to me is the most important thing in our relationship. And if we can work together in any capacity, I think that's a great thing.
Yeah, well, let's plan on that. We've gone through a crazy year. It's sad to see Sue Dykes pass away, and AJ go on to the next thing right now. But I think it's time that we really think through what the next phase is for our partnership, our collaboration, and how to really grow this. That'll be fun. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. And I think maybe a place we might be able to begin that engagement is with maybe a genomics model, right?
Maybe. Let's talk really soon. And I know you guys are also getting into areas that we care about too. I know there's a book being in the works on artificial intelligence.
And we had a book out on transhumanism, which kind of butts into that as well. So
yeah, so at the very least, we'll probably have you back on here. We were talking about maybe having me come and do a show with you two there, but I think what's also been really fun about this is it's not just merely like doing shows for the public. We've been really engaging in some of the deeper stuff, the scientific. We're getting our teeth into the scientific meat of it all, right? And it's been fun. It's been enjoyable, and I look forward to doing that. Let's do more of it. So with that, there you have it. That's what's going on right now in the conversation with Reasons to Believe. They're thinking about evolution, and it's some really good thoughts. I really, really strongly encourage you to pick up this book and check it out. You can read the last chapter, which I think is a really important chapter for the conversation at our Patreon page. Hey, it's going to continue, conversation continuing. Next week, we got Bill Craig coming on, and we're going to be talking about this from a different angle. So thanks a lot, Fuzz. It's really great to have you here.
Thanks, Josh.